All our stories are created for entertainment purposes only.
I'm a 28-year-old guy, and I was supposed to be enjoying my honeymoon in Hawaii today with my life partner Brenda, who's 27. But here I am, writing this Reddit post about the same woman who's now a part of my life. Yesterday was my wedding day, and it was supposed to be the happiest day of my life. However, it turned into a nightmare when I found out that the woman I married just a few hours ago had been fooling around with my best man right before we exchanged our vows. Our wedding was a 2-day affair, starting with a bachelor party and a bachelorette party on the day before the wedding, followed by the actual wedding ceremony yesterday. The plan was for us not to see each other during these 2 days, and I'd only lay eyes on her at the altar. That's how it was supposed to go down. We had our pre-wedding celebrations separately, even though they were held at the same venue. The groomsmen and bridesmaids had the freedom to crash each other's parties, but the bride and groom were off limits to each other. It was a blast. We partied separately and got pretty wasted, eventually passing out around midnight. The next morning, I woke up, got myself ready, and we headed out to welcome our parents. We even went to pick up our grandparents from the airport, and the wedding proceeded according to plan. The ceremony was followed by a lovely lunch, with friends and family toasting to our happiness. Everything seemed perfect up to that point. However, in the middle of all this, I had to use the restroom and overheard the janitors gossiping about witnessing the bride getting intimate with the best man. I stayed hidden and listened to their whole conversation, and that's when things took a crazy turn. One of them claimed to have witnessed the bride, dressed in her wedding gown, passionately kissing the best man in the restroom. I stayed hidden and eavesdropped on their entire conversation. The janitors were convinced they had seen the bride, in her bridal attire, getting cozy with the best man. The other janitor mentioned he had seen the best man entering the bride's room early in the morning, assuming he was the groom, but later realized his mistake. I couldn't resist staying hidden and listening further. When I finally emerged from my hiding spot, all 3 of them were taken aback by my presence. They left the place awkwardly, and I decided to investigate. I checked inside the restroom but found no camera. However, there was a camera installed in the lobby outside. I hurried to the room where my wife had stayed the previous night, and there was also a camera outside her room. I contacted my wedding manager and asked him to retrieve the footage from the lobby camera and the one outside the bride's room. Initially, he hesitated, but my desperation convinced him to help. He tried to calm me down and promised to get the recordings. Reluctantly, I returned to the lunch table, not wanting to create a scene in front of the guests. I couldn't help but notice the body language between my best man and my wife. They were acting completely normal, as if nothing had ever happened between them. I felt a lump in my throat but had no one to confide in. Both my best man and my wife were the most significant people in my life that day, and they had both betrayed me. My restlessness must have been apparent because Brenda and others asked if I was okay. I looked pale and was trembling with anxiety. People were dancing and tried to encourage me to join, but I declined, citing fatigue. When my best man asked Brenda for a dance, it would have been a joyful sight if this had happened before my restroom break. However, now it disgusted me to see them together, knowing what they had done to me. As I watched them dancing, I couldn't help but imagine what they might have done the previous night. I know it sounds pathetic, but I couldn't help but imagine the details of how they had betrayed me. After a while, I received a text from the wedding manager informing me that he had obtained the recordings. I asked him to meet me in my room. Brenda was engrossed in conversation with the best man and other groomsmen. I headed back to my room, collected the footage from him, expressed my gratitude, and requested him to leave. I instructed him to inform anyone inquiring about me that I wanted some alone time. He nodded and exited the room. I locked myself in, my hands trembling as I prepared to view the recordings. I knew that my life was about to change dramatically. As I played the footage of our wedding day from the lobby camera, I witnessed my best man entering the men's restroom. Subsequently, when it emptied out after others had finished using it, he likely locked the door from the inside and summoned Brenda. She discreetly entered the restroom, and they remained locked inside for approximately 10 to 12 minutes. Meanwhile, a few other men attempted to use the restroom, but the door was bolted shut. Eventually, they must have alerted the security or janitors. A janitor came, knocked on the door, but received no response. He directed 2 other men to use a different restroom upstairs. The janitor returned with a key, unlocked the door, and Brenda hurried out of the restroom. Tears welled up in my eyes. This was enough evidence to confirm what had occurred between them. However, my curiosity got the best of me, and I felt compelled to review the footage from the previous night. What I saw was a premeditated and deliberate act of betrayal. They were getting intimate in the lobby while heading toward her room, his hands all over her. I could only imagine what transpired once they entered that room. I cried like a baby, realizing that my wedding day had been ruined by the most important people in my life. I stood in the room, crying and cursing my fate. There were multiple knocks on my door, and my phone buzzed incessantly with texts and calls. I reached out to the event manager and requested that he inform everyone to give me some space. He complied, and the knocking ceased, but Brenda continued to text me to check on my well-being. I eventually turned off my phone, yet my restlessness persisted. I stormed out of the room and found that nearly all the guests had departed. Only a small group of family members, including both sets of parents, siblings, and a few close friends, remained. The best man had also vanished from the scene. Brenda was in tears. Her maid of honor, her parents, and others were consoling her. As soon as they saw me, everyone rushed over. My mom gave me a hug and asked what had gone wrong, but Brenda kept her distance. Maybe she and the best man had some idea of what had transpired. I looked at her and admitted, "I'm canceling the marriage right now." She burst into tears, and the rest bombarded me with questions. I switched on my phone and showed her father the footage of Brenda getting intimate in the lobby. The shock on his face said it all, and everyone grasped the situation. I decided to leave the venue. The event manager contacted me for the final settlement, but I told him to take care of it with the bride, making a scene at the venue. I haven't spoken to anyone since I left that place, driving over 200 miles to a remote countryside where I've been staying since yesterday afternoon. I left the venue in my wedding attire, but along the way, I changed into my gym clothes from the trunk of my car. It's been a pathetic situation. I've isolated myself and haven't uttered a word to anyone. The last meal I had was the wedding lunch. I want to visit the pastor for the annulment process, but I can't seem to find the motivation. Our flight to Hawaii was scheduled for this morning, and amidst all this chaos, I forgot to cancel it. I actually woke up today to the final calls from the airlines to board the flight, so that money went to waste. I did manage to cancel the hotel bookings, but I couldn't get refunds because it was past the check-in time. I only got some money back for the return flight from Hawaii and a few water sports bookings. In reality, I've lost everything, but honestly, the emotional toll is far worse. I'm not sure how I'll cope with this trauma. My head is pounding with pain, and this loneliness is eating away at me. Update. To be honest, I was in a really rough spot. Well, I still am, but things have improved a bit since the last time I posted. I spent over a week in a dismal state, holed up at a shabby motel near the highway where truck drivers and road trippers crash for the night. I didn't care much about the place. All I wanted was to escape from my familiar world. About 2 days later, I forced myself to go downstairs to the supermarket and get some basic supplies. It had been 2 days since I'd eaten anything, and I realized I was practically wasting away. After grabbing some essentials, I finally had a meal. I took a shower and decided to visit the pastor who had officiated our wedding. He was as stunned as anyone when he heard what had happened to me. I told him I was leaving the wedding venue, making up some excuse about attending another wedding. I had no idea about the annulment process, so I asked the pastor about it. He explained that annulments are typically granted in cases of fraud, forced marriages, misinterpretation of vows, or if the vows were taken under the influence, like when you're drunk or stoned. I wondered if we could consider my case as fraud since she cheated on me right before we exchanged our vows. Unfortunately, he told me that in addition to the religious ceremony, we had also legally registered our marriage with the magistrate's office. So, annulment wasn't an option, and I had to go through the divorce process. I dreaded the thought of facing her during the divorce, but I had no other choice. I reached out to my parents, and they were understandably stressed out about the situation. They offered to support me in any way they could. I asked for a lawyer, and luckily, my dad, who's a businessman, had connections with attorneys. He provided me with the contact information of a divorce lawyer who was well-versed in handling such cases. My dad had already discussed my situation with the lawyer, so he was prepared to assist me. The lawyer assured me that in my case, The divorce process should be relatively quick since our marriage had not been legally consummated. I met with the lawyer, and he assured me that the divorce process would go smoothly. He wasted no time and started working on the paperwork. He mentioned that the divorce papers would be ready in a week, and he'd make sure I wouldn't have to pay a dime in alimony. Instead, she would have to cover half of the wedding expenses. My dad had informed him that I had financed the entire wedding, which is why he included this term to recover the wedding costs. I also learned that my dad had settled the payment with the wedding planner. After I left the wedding venue, Brenda's parents promptly left as well, publicly disowning her. Her maid of honor accompanied her, and they departed together. Eventually, only my parents and grandparents remained, gathering my belongings from the wedding and settling things with the planner. My mom handed over the keys to my house. Brenda has moved in with my parents. She reached out to my mom, apologized, and requested her help in reconciling our relationship. Mom made it clear that she wouldn't interfere in our affairs, leaving the decision entirely up to me. Some people questioned in the comments about my choice of best man and how I could have someone like that in my wedding. Let me explain. He's been my friend since college, and we've known each other for a decade. Although he lives in Seattle now, whenever he's in town, we catch up and spend time together. Despite the distance, we've always stayed in touch. When I told him about my wedding, he was even more excited than I was. He flew down a week before the wedding and helped with the preparations and shopping. He's more than just a friend. He's like an extended family member. This wasn't the first time he had met Brenda, and he had never acted inappropriately before. We used to hang out together whenever he visited, even after I started dating Brenda. As for what he was thinking when he crossed the line with my wife before the wedding, I didn't want to dwell on it at the time. All I wanted was some peace of mind. Now let's talk about my soon-to-be ex-wife. We dated for 2.5 years, and even after deciding to get married, we waited for 5 months. During all those years of knowing each other, I never noticed any red flags. She was sweet, understanding, and never made advances toward my friends. Even when we hung out with my best man, there was never anything suspicious. When I returned to my now empty house, it honestly felt haunted. The last time I was here, we were happily preparing for the wedding and our future together. Now it's all in ruins. My mom came to visit me the next day and stayed with me for a few weeks. My mom did an amazing job cleaning up and renovating the house, getting rid of all the stuff Brenda had left behind. Trust me, it made a huge difference. Slowly but surely, I started regaining control over my life. One of the first things I did was join a fitness club to keep myself occupied and clear my mind. I figured I was already exhausting my mind with all these negative thoughts, so I might as well channel that energy into working out and getting something positive out of it. I wasn't really unhealthy or overweight, just a bit on the chubby side, but I've already lost 5 pounds. Thanks, exercise. I've also been keeping myself busy with work. When Brenda received the divorce papers, she reached out to me with a text asking if we could meet. It was her first message since the D-Day, and it hit me hard. I had been avoiding her and treating her like she didn't exist, so when I got her text, all those emotions came rushing back. Eventually, I agreed to meet with her. She looked pale and fragile, but I stood my ground. Our conversation was awkward, filled with one-word responses to her questions. It was all very general, and honestly, talking to her felt strange. I don't know why, but I decided to bring up the topic of her cheating and how she ended up with the best man. My question caught her off guard, and she broke down, eventually confessing. Her answer left me stunned. She said, "I've never cheated on you before, and I never thought I would. I wanted to be faithful to you for the rest of my life, but I confided in my bridesmaids about this, and they suggested I have one last fling before committing to a lifetime with one man." When the best man visited her group during the Bachelor Ed party, he jokingly mentioned that Grindr, referring to Brenda, was looking for someone to hook up with that night before tying the knot. The best man played along, saying, "Sure, I'm game." It was all in good fun, but it planted ideas in both of their heads. They began flirting as part of a game in front of everyone, but their attraction didn't fizzle out when they were alone. Things escalated, and they decided to have some fun the night before the wedding. So it wasn't just a one-time thing, it lasted the entire night. I remember it all happened after I passed out during my bachelor's party. I had to wake up early the next morning to pick up my grandparents from the airport, so I fell asleep shortly after midnight. My best man, on the other hand, was still partying, and that's when everything unfolded. I'm not sure if I should blame myself for going to bed early that night. After she confessed everything, she looked really sad and asked if we could give our relationship one last chance and start over. I told her no, I could never trust her again, and it's better for us to go our separate ways because our relationship wouldn't survive even if I tried. My feelings toward her have changed, and that's not something that can be fixed anytime soon. Maybe I'll forgive her down the road, but trusting her again is a whole different story. She cried, and I was crying too, but I stood my ground and didn't give in. She signed the divorce papers after that and sent them back to my lawyer. So the divorce is all settled now. I'm moving forward with my life, taking things one step at a time. I'm focused on my work, improving my skills, and trying to keep my drinking habits in check, which got a bit out of hand during the divorce. My mom and sister suggest I start dating again, but I'm not jumping back into the dating game anytime soon. Honestly, it's always a bit suspicious when your best man or maid of honor seem more excited and eager about your wedding than you are. It's like they're overcompensating for some intense guilt. In this case, the best man even disappeared, avoiding me after the wedding. The last time I saw him was on my wedding day, dancing with Brenda. I'm sure she must have updated him about our divorce. There was a lingering fear that they might get together after our divorce, but eventually I moved past that feeling of insecurity. Update: Brenda and I never crossed paths again. After moving out of my house, she stayed with her best friend until the divorce was finalized. I don't have any updates about her after that. I blocked her on all social media platforms. As for the best man, he completely ghosted me after the wedding day. The last time I saw him was at my wedding, dancing with Brenda. I'm pretty sure she informed him about our divorce. There was a worry that they might continue seeing each other after our divorce, but I've moved on from that insecurity. A few days ago, I ran into one of my college friends, who was also friends with the best man. He had attended my wedding as a groomsman. I hadn't kept in touch with anyone after the wedding, not even on social media. He told me that the best man was cheated on and dumped by his fiancée. Apparently, some of the groomsmen had heard that the best man was with my wife the night before the wedding, and when he left the venue after I locked myself in the room, they put two and two together. Eventually, news of my divorce got out, and they connected the dots. He mentioned that he lost touch with the best man for quite some time after that incident. However, coincidentally, he received a job offer from the same company where the best man worked, and they started crossing paths at the office occasionally. The best man was dating a co-worker and even got engaged a month ago, but their engagement ended abruptly the day after it happened. Their wedding was scheduled for this month, and our friend had also been invited. However, the wedding got canceled, and that's when he found out about it. During an office party, the best man got drunk and confided in our friend, revealing that his fiancée had cheated on him, leading to the cancellation of the wedding. Our friend tried to console me by saying that the best man had experienced some karma for what he had done to me. I replied that I had moved past feelings of revenge and betrayal. When I was the one being cheated on, I had desperately wanted to ruin the best man's life, but now I simply don't care about either him or Brenda. They are like ghosts to me and hold no significance in my life. As an update for the Reddit community, I'm currently dating a wonderful woman from my office. She's a strong single mom with an adorable daughter, and I can't stop admiring their cuteness and their personalities. It's too early to determine if marriage is on the horizon, but her presence brightens my life. Last month, I introduced her to my parents during a dinner, and they absolutely adore her daughter. It was a heartwarming sight, and while we'd like to move forward with this relationship, we're both cautious and prefer not to rush into things. Perhaps we'll take a couple more years before considering marriage if it even happens. We might start living together soon, though. Story 2. I made a terrible mistake, and I lost the only man I've ever loved because of my selfish beliefs. It devastates me to think that I've caused him pain, but what's even more heartbreaking is realizing that he's gone from my life forever. I wish we could have fixed my mistakes and stayed together. I had a loving partner and friend, but I chose to throw it all away for meaningless flings with random guys. I was just 20 years old when I met my future husband Danny at the library. He handed me a book from the top shelf, and that simple act led to a conversation, and we exchanged numbers. Danny wasn't what you'd call a looker, but he had this irresistible charm about him. Our friendship quickly grew into a romantic relationship. He was my first in so many things. My first date, first kiss, first love, and my first experience. But for him, I wasn't the first, and that made me feel inadequate. He had more experience than me, which left me with doubts. When he proposed, I felt a mix of happiness and fear. I worried that maybe I had made the wrong choice for a life partner because I had no one else to compare Danny to. That's when I first suggested an open relationship, thinking it could help me gain more experience before our wedding. I was being selfish, thinking maybe he wasn't the right one for me. Danny was furious. He made it clear that he didn't want to share me and that he saw me as his future wife. His words touched me deeply, and for a while, I forgot about the idea of an open relationship. I agreed to become his wife. Our wedding was a small but joyful affair, surrounded by our family and friends. The first year of our marriage was wonderful, but eventually those nagging doubts came back. I worried that marriage had taken away the exciting adventures I could have had. My friends would share their stories of flings and excitement, and I had nothing to contribute. So I decided to talk to Danny about it. I initially hinted at the idea of an open relationship, but his reaction showed me that I might lose him if I pushed further. I even suggested spicing up our bedroom life a bit. His blunt and uncompromising response frustrated me. He said he would leave if I went through with it. I felt he was setting unfair boundaries, especially considering his own dating history before me. Why couldn't I do the same? A few months later, I brought up the topic again, hoping for a different response, but I received the same stern answer. Looking back, I realize how selfish I was. I married him while harboring an interest in other men. My thoughts wandered, all while naively hoping to maintain Danny's love. Now I can't help but despise myself for betraying the most important person in my life and giving in to temptation. There's always something that triggers our base desires, and in my case, it was Bob. He was a massive man, built like a bodybuilder, and his snug clothes highlighted his bulging muscles. He effortlessly drew the attention of women, exuding the confidence of an alpha male. Bob was transferred to my department and became my direct supervisor. This meant daily meetings alone together. He was in his 30s, older than both me and my husband. He had a flirtatious manner, always speaking in a seductive tone that made it challenging to remain strictly professional around him. One evening, Bob surprised me by asking if I'd like to grab drinks after work. I couldn't believe it. Was he genuinely interested, or was it just polite conversation? My mind raced, but I couldn't turn him down. We headed to a nearby bar where I ended up drinking too much. Our conversation shifted from formal to intimate, and I found myself confessing my desire for more than just being a faithful wife to one man. I spilled everything, from the idea of an open marriage that allowed freedom without guilt to my attraction toward him. Bob inquired if I had discussed this with my husband, and I told him that I had, but my husband didn't share my perspective and had said he would leave if I pursued it. Bob then suggested that I shouldn't seek permission, but instead present it to my husband as a done deal. He proposed opening up my marriage so I could explore this without needing Danny's consent. Looking back, Bob was the epitome of bad decisions, the type of person who gives terrible advice under the guise of it being for the woman's benefit. Now I realize that he just wanted to sleep with me, but in that moment I was grasping for any justification for my desires. That night, Bob took me to a hotel and made me feel like the queen of the universe. I know Danny made me feel that way every day, but experiencing it with another man made me feel like a giddy teenager again. When I got home, my husband was already asleep on the couch, as if he had been waiting for me to return from work. I quietly sneaked into the bathroom to wash away the smell of alcohol and unfamiliar cologne. Then I woke Danny up and told him I needed to discuss something important. He replied that he also had some important and happy news to share, which he wanted to tell me first. A delighted smile lit up his face as he listened attentively, but it vanished within seconds. However, I didn't care because I had already made up my mind that I was doing the right thing. I simply stated that I wanted to spend time with other men, and it would be great if he could support me. I desired other men, and I wanted him to allow me the same freedom he once enjoyed with other women. Otherwise, I couldn't be happy with him. It pains me to think about the hurtful words I spoke to the person who had once cherished me. Those words still haunt me, and tears well up every time I recall that moment. How foolish I was. He stared at me for a long time, then bowed his head in defeat. After sitting in silence for what felt like an hour, he muttered, "Well, if that's how you feel, then fine by me." He got up and walked away without ever sharing his joyful news. The very next day, I eagerly surrendered to my boss's advances. We had an affair on his desk, and that was just the beginning. Bob became my first lover after Danny, but far from my last. I started going out on Fridays with colleagues to their favorite pub, and sometimes woke up on Saturdays in the arms of a stranger I never saw again. I had become promiscuous, all while believing that Danny had come to terms with it. I continued sleeping with different men almost daily, but after 2 months, reality slapped me in the face. One Friday, while getting ready for work, Bob came by to pick me up, assuming my husband had already left for the day as usual. I thought we could seize the opportunity for some intimacy before heading to the office. However, to my surprise, Danny was still at home. He answered the door to find Bob standing there with flowers in hand. I couldn't make out their conversation over the noise of the shower. When I emerged, they were conversing amicably, as if everything was normal. Danny never displayed any emotion. No anger, hurt, disappointment, or sadness, just smiles or frowns. I genuinely thought he was completely okay with our open marriage. My naive, childish mind failed to see that I was only hurting myself. During the drive to work, Bob teased me about how well my husband seemed to have accepted the concept of an open relationship. It happened on a Friday. Bob and I booked a room with an incredible view of the city skyline. That night, we shared passionate intimacy. I returned home the next day on Saturday. As soon as I stepped inside, I sensed that something was amiss. An unusual silence hung in the air. My husband and I never worked on weekends, and he would usually have his favorite music blasting through the speakers. I peeked into our home gym, but he wasn't on the treadmill like he usually was on Saturday mornings. Hoping to find some sense of normalcy, I made my way to the kitchen, expecting him to have made coffee as he always did. On the kitchen counter, I noticed my favorite mug. It brought a smile to my face, offering a glimpse of our shared life. I reached for the mug, hoping to take a sip, only to discover it was empty. Inside, I found an envelope with a letter. I can't recall the exact words now, but I've kept it as a painful reminder of how I let a beautiful marriage crumble for the sake of casual flings. I'm deeply disappointed in myself. I've made many foolish mistakes, but losing Danny is my most profound regret. The note revealed that Danny had left for a month-long business trip to Canada. Upon his return, he intended to initiate divorce proceedings. He expressed regret for marrying me and spending so much time together. Next to the letter, there was a plane ticket and a passport with my name on it. A message on the back of the ticket read, "Remember the news I mentioned 2 months ago? Here it is. My company was willing to cover both our accommodations in Canada. They even offered you a job there. But what struck me the hardest was finding his wedding ring at the bottom of the mug. It was like my world crumbled right before my eyes. I spent the entire day just staring blankly at that mug, unable to eat or drink, lost in despair. What followed was a deep depression as my life slowly fell apart. The very next day, almost as if it was planned, Danny's best friend showed up to collect all his belongings. I cried uncontrollably as I watched him and some movers take away nearly everything that belonged to my husband. Danny's friend gave me a disgusted look and called me a derogatory name. His words hurt at the time, but they cut even deeper now, because ever since my husband left, my home has felt painfully empty and desolate. I tried to distract myself by jumping from one relationship to another, trying to numb the pain of losing my beloved. And then, barely a week after it all happened, Bob requested a transfer. When I asked why and mentioned that I thought something special was developing between us, he coldly replied that he was moving on now that the excitement was over. I felt utterly betrayed, and my new boss instantly took a disliking to me. My personal life was in such turmoil that it started affecting my work, and before long, I was fired due to yet another mistake. My parents and friends disowned me, thanks to Danny's buddy who spilled the beans about my promiscuous behavior. They wanted nothing to do with a woman who had thrown her marriage away for another man. In a short amount of time, I lost everyone who mattered to me. A month later, Danny returned from his trip and proceeded with our divorce. I pleaded with him multiple times to listen and even suggested couples counseling, suspecting I might have nymphomania, but he refused to engage with me at all. By the time we officially split, I was left without our cozy home, without the support of my loving partner, and without a single soul who cared about me. I still deeply despise myself for destroying it all.